Hey everyone, welcome back to your favorite sales podcast. I'm your host, Ross Rich, and today we have a very special guest. We have Shannon Hopkins, RVP of Enterprise Account Management at BetterUp. We're going to learn a few things about people management and leadership from her experience there, but also just generally talking about best practices for operationalizing excellence when it comes to sales and success. So, welcome to the show, Shannon.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks for having me. Good to
Of
see you.
course. And this is a long time coming because we've both been on the road a ton doing the job. So I'm excited to talk to a practitioner who's been out there leading the team from the front. I love it. But before we get into the details, if you want to say just a few words about yourself, what you're up to now, and kind of how you found your way to revenue leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently, as you said, I'm the RVP of Enterprise Account Management at BetterUp. I feel incredibly lucky to do this job every day. And a part of the reason why I wanted to take the job was actually to invest in myself. And part of what
Mm,
we'll talk about today is I think leaders a lot of the time get left behind. As you said, we're on the road, we're doing the job, we're doing all the things all the time. And so really wanted to not only focus on developing my leadership skills, but learning about how to operate teams at peak performance. And the opportunity came to me at a really interesting time in my life. I know we met through my charity that focuses
yeah,
on raising money for leukemia. And so it just felt like the right time to dive into how we can help others, unlock their own human potential. Um,
amazing.
and I think that's a story, but right place, right time, a story of my career and things really, the universe speaking to me and coming, opportunities being presented at the right place and the right time. So yeah.
I love that. Yeah, the alignment of not just kind of professional career, but kind of personal mission and everything that you do outside of the sales space, which maybe at the end we can talk a little bit about. But yeah, we like to talk about strategies for building cultures and teams that what we say is like execute with excellence. So ask for kind of three different strategies. The first one you talked about is manager effectiveness.
Yeah.
Honestly, coming from the startup world, I don't have a great background in some of the formal frameworks for this, and obviously, with your time at BetterUp, you've learned a few things. So excited to hear how you think about leveraging manager effectiveness when it comes to execution excellence.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to talk about it. I mean, I guess I would say at BetterUp, like I said, we're kind of focused on unlocking human potential and helping people and organizations do this at scale. And I find the science behind it. I'm a science nerd myself. That was my educational background. I just find it so exciting and interesting. And I think one thing that organizations miss a lot is, we're always invested in like finding the latest and greatest tools and process and restructuring our organization, but a lot of the times we really forget about the people that are behind that, and those are really the ones that are going to help us execute on like the transformations or
Yeah.
the goals and the visions that we have, and even more so true for frontline leaders, and that middle layer of managers. So if you're like a CRO or a VP that has managers and managers reporting to you, those individuals on the front lines are usually the ones that get left behind. And so when
Mhm.
we think about, driving excellence, especially in sales and customer service teams, you really have to focus on like, what are you doing for your leaders, as the leaders are the ones that set the tone, the
Mhm.
cadence, and the culture that enable high performance for your organization.
Totally. That's honestly been one of my biggest learnings from working on a core these last 4.5 years has been the challenge of that frontline leader role
Yeah.
and that you're asked to do so much. You have the responsibility of a manager, but you have not a lot of training in the job. You've typically been a top performer doing the thing. Now you're responsible for like 10 other people doing the thing really well with very few resources and kind of very demanding
Yeah.
asks from people that typically don't really know the details of your job. And that's been one of the most surprising things is at the next levels, very few, I found VPs, to be honest, understand still what it's like to do the job. And especially since things have been changing so fast. So is
Yeah.
that something that you've kind of dug into a bit and think about?
It's funny you say that. One of the, you read about leaders and, effective leaders over time. And one thing that has really stuck out to me over time is the former CEO of SurveyMonkey. I think he sadly had passed away in an accident, but I remember listening to or reading something that he said is that when he became CEO, that he really had two meetings a week, and one was with his head of product and one was with his head of sales. And the rest of the time, he really spent in the trenches with people who were on the front line or with customers, and
Mm,
that's how he kept his finger on the pulse of what was going on in his business. I experienced this myself. I just before taking the RVP role, I was a GM for one of our products here at BetterUp, and kind of got out of that commercial space. And so as I
mhm.
was thinking about leading the product strategy there, and became several layers removed, and it really did become that much harder to figure out, what was the next thing that we needed to do, and a
Yeah,
lot of times the answers are right within your teams.
totally. And then you think, right? It's a classic, like, why don't you just do this? And
Hmm.
like it kind of sounds really dumb if you're like a person doing it. You're like, well, obviously this reason, but if you don't know that, you lose a lot of the
Yeah.
I think like trust and social capital of your team. Um, but yeah, how do you balance both of those things? How do you balance both like needing to lead, but
Hmm.
also have your finger on the pulse of making the suggestions and kind of relatability to the rest of the org?
Yeah. One of the things that we talk a lot about, and I find especially true even for myself, is this experience of there's this a lot of this context switching that's happening in this leader role every day, right? Like, okay, you're interviewing someone over here, then you're talking to a C-level executive, then you're talking to your C-level executive. And there's a lot of just context switching throughout the
Mm,
day. And so really investing in what is in the research called meta skills. So we know that like developing the skills, the hard skills, the more technical skills are important for individuals, but the pace at which everything is changing is just accelerating so much. So if you teach someone like, AI is hot right now, right? You teach someone a skill around AI, that's going to be obsolete in like the next 12 months, probably. So how are you teaching people how to learn, how to
mm.
navigate challenges? We talk a lot about cognitive agility, problem solving, like those more meta skills, in order to be able to help people accelerate and go faster, because there's always going to be like the next challenge or change to navigate, the next COVID, the next, what have you. And so really just focusing in developing of people at that level.
Yeah, no, I like that the concept of those meta skills, the things that cross over, right? And I think I've heard that before of like horizontal thinking and learning of like
Yeah.
not just applying to one thing, and that the kind of next set of I think just always top performers have been the folks that can apply learnings from like, well, I learned how to learn this AI skill, so I'm going to be fine for the next one, even if it changes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then, the where you have managers and leaders that are, showing that themselves, you're going to have that ripple effect on your team, right?
Mm,
You're going to have teams that are more engaged and more productive and more innovative. And that's, you kind of get that compounding effect of that innovation among the team. And so that effectively making your job easier as the leader, not having to be the one owning and doing all of that all the time, and having some of that driven from the team.
totally. Well, before we move on to the next topic, about identifying and elevating pilots in your team, excited to hear what that means. Any other kind of final thoughts on the manager effectiveness piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think, investing in your managers and making them feel that they're an important layer of the organization, but also how they're creating that psychological safety among their teams. I think we were talking about innovation and, bringing new ideas. There has to be that environment where people feel safe to do that. And, we can talk about that a little bit in a bit, but that being a really important factor to help people take risks and speak up and, ultimately admit mistakes, what they don't know, what they're unsure of, so that you can help lean in as a manager.
Yeah, no, it's I'm excited to get into that. But yeah, curious what you mean about pilots. I'm assuming we're talking about internally, not necessarily about pilots with customers, because we don't love those. But what do you mean by identifying and elevating pilots within your team?
Yeah, this has been really interesting in some of the research. So we at BetterUp had done a study with Stanford.
Mm.
around the adoption of AI and how individuals, there's kind of groups within your organizations that show up of these proactive employees who are more willing to embrace new ideas and take on new challenges. And that shows up a lot with like how people are adopting AI, right? And then, passengers. So people who are maybe not contributing in the same way. They are maybe more reactive and depend on more like direction to move forward. So you can probably think of like a few people on your team who fall into these categories today,
Yeah.
right? And so identifying like who your pilots are on your team and making sure that you're investing in them and developing them will help you exponentially grow the results on your team.
So how do you do that? How do you pick the right people? How do you make sure that do you have any examples of yeah, making sure you're picking the right people and elevating them?
Yeah, so thinking about like people on your team who don't just complete tasks, right? Like they anticipate, we call it like perspection, or put on your perspection goggles and anticipating future challenges, finding creative solutions, and like who are the people who are naturally out there helping their peers or, seeking to understand a new concept.
Hmm.
And like these are the people who are usually really motivated to take ownership of like the team's goals or others development. And so you can spot them by looking for volunteers, right, for challenging projects or driving discussions in meetings who's constantly speaking up and raising their hand. This might be an account executive who's like not only hitting their quota, but identifying new opportunities for an untapped market or strategic partnerships or partners that, could benefit the broader team, for example. So those are
Hmm.
a few ways to spot those people.
Got it. So making sure that their next exciting role is internally instead of maybe looking for something that's a step up elsewhere.
Yeah, and like just keeping them engaged, right? Like we know it's a super competitive market out there as far as where people have opportunities to go for their next opportunity and
Yeah,
continue to foster and pour into those individuals that you see as being those differentiators on your team is really important and creating opportunities for them to take on even more responsibility in their current role give them a little bit of freedom, more freedom than others, right, to explore and solve problems, work on passion projects that they have, or give them like decision-making rights over something, or bring them into a leadership conversation. Super important. And again, like, retaining our top talent is always super critical in a sales environment, and making sure that we get that rep productivity.
totally. And then how do you balance that and the fairness of the way you treat that particular person with the folks that need more direction to be successful, right? Because I
Yeah.
think always think about, okay, like it's hard, especially if you have big teams and you're scaling, like how do you make sure that you're having this individualized approach while trying to keep it fair across the different members of your team and organization?
Yeah, I mean, that's like part of what is so great about being a manager and part of the puzzle pieces that you're putting together is not every, interaction or relationship that you have with an individual in your team is going to look the same and not every way
Hmm.
it's the same thing, right? So just making sure that those individuals also feel like they're being invested in, but maybe they're being invested in a different way, right? So whereas your pilots is a little bit more automated, right? Like you're giving them more autonomy to go out and, play with things and break things. Whereas with maybe some of your calling passengers, those people are a little bit more reactive. Maybe you're giving them more one-on-one support. You're spending more time with them, coaching, giving them challenge, setting goals with them, and making sure like they're taking on projects that are, inside their comfort zone and giving
Hmm.
them, proactive feedback.
I like that. What I always find hard with that is I feel like when you're stepping into this leadership role and moving up different levels, it feels like you almost need to like follow a process. At least that's myself because I'm like a, process person. And it feels like you need to go against that in so many ways when it comes to, effective leadership, right? You're talking about, okay, you need to treat everyone differently, but there's like, you want to learn this framework of management at the
Yeah.
same time of being super flexible. And that's what I personally find really hard about nailing that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, everybody is, not everyone is created equal. And I think if you're going to get the most out of your team, you have to identify what, each of those individuals need.
Yeah.
And the framework is great, to get you started and give you like a place, to pivot from.
Hmm.
But you have to kind of, each team is different and you're going to have to kind of make it your own along the way.
Totally, totally. That's the challenge and the fun of it. But yeah,
Yeah.
shifting gears to the last piece, and this is what I'm honestly most excited to talk to you about because I think it's what you've lived and experienced at BetterUp is how well-being ties to peak performance and enhancement. So curious to get your take on how I should be using maybe some more of my soft skills when it comes to leadership to get more out of my team.
Yeah, this has been so my previous role, we didn't talk a lot about it, but previously to BetterUp, I worked at, I guess you could call it a well-being company, a benefits company, League, startup here in Toronto
Yeah.
that was, focused on benefits solutions for B2B companies. And so, bringing this to life through the work that I'm doing now at BetterUp has been really exciting. And the one thing that I found really interesting, right, is you're looking at business outcomes or talent outcomes, things that you are looking to achieve, whether that's like performance, productivity, what have you. The underlying elements that go into that from a human perspective are
Hmm.
all these mindsets and behaviors, right? So things like focus, things like, self-efficacy, self-compassion. Those are all elements that go into building that peak performance or performance culture.
Hmm.
And it's about the whole person, right? So while you can, again, like we're talking about, while you can focus on those skills developments, you first need to be able to like show up as your best self at work, right? And show up to be able to
It's a
focus
prerequisite basically of the
more.
of the
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Like if you have a bunch of stuff going on in at home or whatnot, and your stress levels are super high or you're burnt out, like you're not going to show up and be effective at work. And so I think sometimes organizations, as we were talking about earlier, like really forget about that component. Like if you think
Hmm.
about a sports team or the military, like they're constantly focused on the 360-degree view of the people on their team and making sure that they have all the resources and supports that they need to show up every day to perform.
Yeah, and I think that's the tricky stuff that honestly it feels like in in modern society and workplaces, I find it hard to know how deep to go into that and different people's comfort levels there. And it almost feels like there's so many ways to do it wrong that I
Yeah.
almost lean away from it because I'm afraid of doing it wrong because it seems like there's such intense consequences from saying the wrong thing when it comes to non-work stuff. So what's your take on
Yeah.
that? Is that something that's come up and not just myself feeling and thinking that?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's scary, especially if a leader, if you've had a bad experience before, right? Or something,
Because you
you know,
hear about these stories and you're like, I don't want to be that person. And it
yeah.
feels so easy to like say the wrong thing in the wrong way, just like, in passing and be like, oh shit, now it's this like terrible experience that I was trying to help and it made me hurt.
Yeah, and I think too, again, depending on your comfort level as a leader, I think you can take those, one-to-one like personalized approach and do those check-ins. A simple thing that you've probably heard before that I just always find helps for me for individuals is like, how are you doing? Okay, but how are you really doing? And how we would do discovery with our customers, doing that with the people on our team. And what I've done with individuals is just saying, hey, like, I know this has been a busy week for you. How are you feeling? How are you doing? Like, are you, sorry about my dog there. Are you, it
So
seems like
cute.
you might be a little tired. Like, talk to me. Like, how can I help
Mm,
you? What does support look like from me for you right now? And having those conversations. So that's like a one-on-one approach that you could
yeah.
take.
So they
And
can kind of opt into it. I like that. So instead of you having to be like, oh, I could tell this person, like, let me ask them about their personal life, more of like probing. That's a really good tip. Yeah.
yeah, and then also just like if you don't feel comfortable with the one-on-one approach, taking a team approach to it, right? So having those conversations in a team meeting, encouraging people to take time to, for self-care, like practice, regular breaks, schedule it in, give people those extra 5 minutes here, there, or whatnot. But
Hmm.
and then practicing it yourself as a leader is probably the hardest part, I would say, right? And so,
Yeah.
making sure you're taking your vacations, making sure you're saying, hey, like I'm not feeling my best, today. I don't think I'm showing up well for you as a team. Like I'm gonna take, the afternoon off to recharge my batteries and do what I need to do to get, my life things sorted so that I can show up tomorrow and, be a better leader for you.
Totally. And then how do you the trickiest part on top of all of this is how do you balance having a very performance outcome based culture with
Mhm.
this, right? Because let's say, we're both, revenue leaders focused on, outcomes, making sure we hit the quarter. Sometimes if you hear that from a leader, you're like saying like, oh, it's all good if we're just not focused on making sure we get there. And
Yeah.
does everyone understand the intricacies of like, okay, well, I'm taking a break now, but that like I'm gonna come back later and do that. Like, how do you think about balancing the human aspect with the performance and outcome based? Because it a lot of times feels like they're out ahead with each other.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And I think as you were talking, the thing that stuck out in my mind is it's really hard to do unless you have that culture of trust on the team, right? Unless you feel trust as a leader and the individuals on your team, that it's really hard to say, yeah, sure, like take an hour here or there and then come back. But again, like I said, I think it comes back to emulating the behaviors yourself. And then I would also say is, I think we talk about in deals sometimes you need to slow down to speed up,
Hmm.
right? Stop at that stage two discovery phase and make sure you're doing enough discovery. And I think
Yes,
same with individuals. Like I do some of my best thinking when I'm out on a walk with my dog. And if I'm sitting at a desk just looking at the same words over and over again on my page, I could probably sit there for hours versus if I
completely.
step away for a bit and come back, I have a whole fresh perspective. And so I think also, again, just like sharing those little tidbits or things that work for you and your team, and creating that space.
Yeah, no, that's a good call out. And yeah, it always reminds me of like if I really take a couple days off and I come back, I'm like, I can see everything just so much more clearly. I'm like, oh my God, yes, I should have taken this, time off way before, and it's so helpful. But then when
Yeah.
you're in the moment, the week or two before, you're like, it's going to be impossible. I have so much to do, and it's really hard
Yeah.
to get that right.
I just think about if someone is not going to perform, they're probably not going to perform. And like, what's going to give them the best chance of success? Is it to say, I care about you as a person. I see you're struggling. Take a minute, come back, and like, let's reset and see how we can move this forward versus like continuing to just, push them and hammer them to come in and, make those 50 more calls, like
Yeah, yeah.
I just think about it in the aspect of slow down to speed up, and that really applies to people too.
Totally. Well, it's funny in retrospect. I'm like thinking about all these now like very human people-based management things. It feels like there's so many dimensions of being an effective manager and leader. It's almost like I don't know if I can even take on this whole new thing because there's first the frameworks of people management and leadership and company strategy that you take on outside of an IC role. And then there's the performance and tactical stuff, right? Like then there's the job. That alone to work with 8 or 10 different people that have different skills and wills and backgrounds and all the stuff just to get that right feels like 150% job. And then you layer on the like very one, personal part of it feels like another whole thing that feels even harder. So yeah, there's a lot you can get right, but it's a big role.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of the conversation, right? Like you can have the best like frameworks, the best processes, the best, setup in your organization, but if you're not really thinking about the human aspect of it and how you're supporting and taking care of the humans on your team, then you probably will be capping, the results that you can have from a
Yeah.
performance.
Yeah. Doesn't matter if you have the right strategy and tactics if the people aren't motivated and trust you and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's a really good point. But no, this was awesome. I got a lot to think about. Hopefully, other folks out there kind of reflecting on their leadership and management style and some areas to improve. But Shannon, appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to chat.
Thanks, Ross. Appreciate it.